The top business stories live from the Sky newsroom. America is trying to break us. Mark Carney vows to fight back against Donald Trump as his party wins the Canadian election. 100 days of the Trump presidency. We'll assess how the world has changed in that time with a former chief executive of Barclays. Plus, M&S counts the cost of its cyber attack that has caused chaos in its stores and online. Very good morning. Welcome to Business Live with me, Darren McCaffrey, on this Tuesday. Well, President Trump is trying to break us so that America can own us, and that will never, ever happen. That's the words of Mark Carney, the newly elected Prime Minister of Canada. His Liberal Party pulled off a stunning victory in the general election, thanks mainly, it must be said, to one man, Donald Trump, and his annexation threats and a trade war. Well, let's speak to our economics and data editor, Ed Conway, who joined us this morning. Ed, very good morning to you. I mean, there's little doubt that Donald Trump has helped Mark Carney turn that election around in Canada. But let's be frank about this. Despite all the tough talk, and there was an election campaign on, Donald Trump could probably break Canada if he wanted to. I mean, Canada's only 10% in terms of economic size compared to the United States.
Yeah, there's no doubting of the scale here, and it would be disastrous for Canada if there were to be further tariffs. I mean, those specific tariffs on Canada and Mexico are still hanging kind of like a sword of Damocles. So every so often there'll be one of these moments, and we're going to have lots of these pinch points in the coming months where Donald Trump is going to be able to say, oh, those tariffs that were suspended, well, they are going to be imposed. And the question at each point is, what the negotiation is going to be and whether that imposition actually happens. But it's worth just saying, I mean, it's not just Canada that would be affected. For Canada, it would be disastrous were those tariffs to be imposed. But also for the US, there would be some implications as well. I mean, remember that the majority of American oil comes from Canada. And actually, Canadian oil is a particularly thick type of oil, which for all sorts of reasons is one of the only oils in the world that's compatible with most of the refineries in America. In other words, if that's gone, then America has a real problem in terms of getting hold of the gasoline they need to run all of their engines. So this does run both ways, and that's always the case with trade. Usually your countries are trading with each other. One thing comes from one country, another comes from the other country, and as a result, you're both affected if there are the imposition of all these tariffs. But that being said, the interesting thing, I think, about the run-up to this election is, first of all, the extent to which Mark Carney has become a politician. I mean, we know him, most of us here in the UK, as a central banker. And, although charismatic, he didn't speak in a political way, and he's really transformed in the way that he's kind of appeared in Canada. And secondly, he has transformed in terms of his policies. This is a man who's associated originally with, particularly when he kind of left office in the UK, with the UN and with climate. So he was pushing for net zero. One of his first things when he came to office was eliminating one of the carbon taxes faced by Canadian citizens, which was very unpopular. So that shows a kind of pragmatism, although some people within the environmental community might not be very happy about it. But finally, obviously, it's Donald Trump, and he has been elected as, to some extent, almost in a warlike manner. He's been saying that he's going to be fighting for Canada, and the question now is to what extent he continues to fight. To what extent does he continue to kind of adopt that mode, and to what extent does Donald Trump respond? Because he does tend to like strong advocates and strong opponents, and in this case, it does seem to be the kind of thing that he responds to.
It is, but at the same time, I mean, my thought process is that, and they will probably meet at some stage, and Canada, I think, is hosting the G7 this year, isn't it? Clearly as well. But, Canada will want to do a deal. He will probably have to compromise despite the language, Mark Carney, won't he?
I think he will have to compromise, but I think in both parties will have to compromise. I remember the background to this, Darren, which is that at the moment, so there was this trade deal that covered North America called NAFTA, which goes back to, I think, the 1990s. That then was updated under the first Donald Trump presidency. So in 2018, there was the new successor to NAFTA, which is a Donald Trump deal. Not massively changed, but there are some extra changes to it. And so it is in the interests of all of the people, all of the countries of North America, so the US, Canada and Mexico, to try to come to some kind of a deal, because they've shown in the past that they've wanted to do free trade with each other. It seems, and most people within the kind of economic community assume that of all of the different asks for Donald Trump, that is probably the easiest one, because he's shown that he's willing to do a deal before. He's shown that he's willing to suspend these tariffs when the going gets tough. And we haven't seen, this is perhaps critical, we haven't seen any of the biggest economic pain yet that would be imposed if there were full blanket tariffs across North America. Like I say, the aluminium tariffs, they're already imposed, and they could well be very painful, because most of the aluminium in America comes from Canada. So we're still kind of waiting to see what happens from that. But it's early days, and the longer these things stay in place, the tougher the economy gets and the more recessionary it feels, both in the US but also in Canada as well.
OK, Ed, great stuff. As always, thank you very much indeed, Ed Conway, for us there. Well, the Canadian result is just one example of how the world has changed in the last 100 days. Under the second Trump presidency. Delighted to say joining me now is Anthony Jenkins, former Chief Executive of Barclays, currently the Chief Executive and founder of 10x Banking. Very good morning to you, Anthony. I suppose my first question, just following on from Ed Conway there, I'm sure you probably heard my interview with him. I mean, you were at Barclays for a time when Mark Carney was Governor of the Bank of England. What do you think about him as a person, his change to politics, who he is, and that relationship, or anyone's relationship, with President Trump?
Well, interestingly, listening to the piece, I was old enough to remember when that NAFTA deal was signed. I was actually living in the United States back in the late 90s. And I think it just illustrates, the ebb and flow of politics. Now, I'm not a politician, I'm a business person. I obviously knew Mark Carney and know him and worked with him. I have an enormous amount of respect for him. And congratulations to him on winning the election in Canada. He's obviously got a long agenda ahead of him, as you were discussing.
Just in terms of President Trump himself and what we've seen in that first 100 days, no one could deny that he's not hit the ground running, but he has shown his willingness, or maybe been forced to change his mind quite a lot, not least of all on tariffs.
Well, I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is that President Trump was democratically elected by the American people and is pursuing the agenda that he laid out in the run-up to that election. So that's the first thing. I think what makes this so challenging, though, if you're a business person like myself, is the short-term implications are unclear, and as you've just said, change all the time. But it's also not clear what the long-term implications are for this. So where does this settle? And all business people hate uncertainty. We can deal with almost anything if we know what it is. But this amount of volatility, of course, has injected a lot of concern about the direction of the global economy and what some of the second and third order consequences of a recession would be, and further conflict over trade around the world. And they could be very serious, obviously. And that uncertainty is reflected. You can see it in the bond markets, you can see it in the stock markets around the world, you can see it in the IMF economic forecasts.
And of course, big banks have been affected as well, in many ways. They're the oil, if you like, of the world's economy.
Yeah, and one of the things about banking, of course, is there are many different components to it. If you look at the trading parts of banks, they're probably doing quite well through this volatility. Trading books tend to respond well to the ups and downs of markets. But if you look at the other parts of the bank, the M&A, the advisory, the deal-doing part, that's no doubt quietened as this uncertainty hangs over markets. And then you've got the real fundamentals of banking, which is credit. And that goes back to what I was saying before. If you get an environment in which it becomes more recessionary globally, that put pressure on the credit books of banks. And of course, if that means that central banks cut interest rates, that could challenge net income margins for banks as well. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the economy, which is reflected in the outlook for banks themselves. And that's why you can see that bank stocks were some of the most volatile when the tariff news was announced a few weeks back.
And just very finally, Anthony, what about Scott Bessent and all of this? He is from kind of the established world that you're from. He is a respected name and has been on Wall Street for a long period of time, but he now is in the Trump administration. You read reports that he's constantly kind of trying to row Donald Trump in, if you like. What do you think his role here is? And that also that connection that Donald Trump, at least in his first term, seemed to have with big banks, with Wall Street, with the global financial community?
Well, I frankly have no idea no insight on that question that you just asked me. I think the administration, as I said, is clearly following the policies that President Trump laid out in his election campaign. But as your correspondent was observing before, the global economy is highly interconnected. And so when you change one part of it, it affects other parts of it. And at the end of the day, I think most world leaders are pragmatists, and they want to do the best thing for their societies and their economies. And so my view is that over the medium to long term, this will settle in a more manageable place.
Okay.
But I expect it to be quite volatile in the short term.
Andy, just very quickly, while I've got you, you've run major banks, and we've had two stories in the last kind of couple of days that have really exposed in some ways the challenges in a way, which is that massive electricity cutout in Spain, and then this cyber attack on M&S. And it's a reminder, isn't it, that, banks, like everything else, rely a lot on technology these days. And that technology, as we're seeing, can very easily fall over. And that presents enormous challenges, doesn't it?
Of course. I mean, the great thing about technology is it's enabled many things in our lives. We can now pay our bills on our phone. We don't have to write checks. We don't have to carry a lot of cash with us. All of these things are huge benefits. But of course, along with that comes the risks that you've articulated. If you get a massive power outage, as we saw in Spain and Portugal yesterday, if you get cyber attacks, and cyber attacks are just a fact of life. In my own business, 10x Banking, we've built a whole suite of modern technologies to fit banks for the new era. But it's a constant challenge for banks dealing with very old technology to deal with all of these pressures.
Yeah, indeed. Anthony, really appreciate your insights this morning. Thank you very much indeed, Anthony Jenkins there.
Thank you.
Now, grocery sales were boosted this month by Easter, falling late, up some 6.5% compared to last year, according to Canto. That's despite the price of chocolate Easter eggs rising by some 17.4%. Joining me now is Sally Ball, who is an analyst at Canto. Thank you, Sally, for joining us. Easter eggs, a hell of a lot more expensive this year, but it didn't stop us buying them.
No, it certainly didn't. As you said, the amount of inflation on chocolate has been kind of disproportionately high, hasn't it, versus the rest of grocery. But in terms of the amount that we've been buying, actually, it's pretty much held stable if we compare it to that similar period in the run up to Easter last year. So it does show that we are willing to pay a little bit more just to be able to treat ourselves and treat our friends and family.
And in terms of where we are now, we know there's somewhat of a price war going on at the moment, isn't there, between the big supermarkets? How is that kind of shaking out in terms of what consumers are seeing?
So, I mean, it's definitely competitive out there. I don't think anyone would disagree with that at the moment. We are seeing that the amount of spend that's going on promotion has increased. So we're up to about 30p in every pound now is being spent on promotion. And kind of linking that back to what you were asking me there, the types of promotions that are becoming really popular and are seeing that greatest uplift are those price cuts. So it does show that retailers are investing hard to be able to attract shoppers through their doors.
And do we know where kind of consumer sentiment is? There's clearly concerns, we've been talking about them just now, around the global economy and the impact that might well have here in the UK. But you know what? The weather's nice at the moment. That normally gets people out and about. Particularly when it comes to things like DIY.
Yeah, it certainly does. We know that Easter is a really important period, don't we, for kind of DIY and decorating. So interestingly, when we look at those grocers, so obviously my expertise is with those grocers, they don't quite normally get the share that we'd expect them to get at that time of year. When we get our latest figures through in the next couple of days for that, we'll be looking very carefully to see whether the retailers have used that to really give them an advantage at this time.
OK, Sally, thank you very much indeed. Sally Ball there, thank you. Now, talking about retailers, Marks and Spencer is continuing to count the cost of last week's cyber attack. Yesterday, it told hundreds of agency workers at his main distribution centre to stay at home because of the incident. More than £500 million has been wiped off the company's value over the last week. And there are reports today of potentially some goods not appearing in actual stores. Let's speak to Max Vetter. He's VP of Cyber at Immersive Labs. Very good morning to you, Max. And you know, this is a serious incident. There's little doubt about that.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's the worst nightmare for any organisation, and we're seeing more and more organisations hit with cyber attacks like this that will put them out of, you know, stock out of stores and really close large parts of the companies down for extended periods.
And what can companies do just in the immediate term? I mean, what will Marks and Spencer now be trying to do to try and mitigate the worst aspects of this cyber attack?
Yeah, their technical teams will currently be working flat out, so they will be trying to remediate, trying to stop what's happened, and I know they brought in external cyber experts as well to help them. So that's the kind of technical side, but all part of that is then the executive and the communication team and the legal teams. They all have just as an important job to reassure customers, to keep calm, and they have been doing that to the most part. They've been transparent about what's happening, not too much information, but not you know, enough to let customers know that they're on it. But yeah, it's definitely that goodwill I think they've got at the moment it depends on time. It depends how long it takes them to remediate it.
Yeah, particularly if you can't get Percy Pigs. I think we're just showing them on screen there in an M&S store. Max, you talked about the fact that this seems to be happening more. We're certainly reporting on it more. What is that? Is it simply that cyber attacks are on the rise and there are various different actors behind that? But it is also, or is it also, I should say, because, you know, stores, shops, big companies haven't quite got the kind of firewalls in place that they need?
Well, it's obviously depending on each organisation, or every organisation is different, but it is now cyber and computers are connected to everything from their stock and their, you know, the supply chain, that these actors are so advanced now that they will probably have been in the M&S network for a while, and that's what they do. They get in. We don't know exactly what this is. It hasn't been confirmed. There are reports that it's a ransomware attack, and it has all the hallmarks of a classic ransomware attack, where they put this ransomware onto the machines of M&S. They will also potentially have exfiltrated data from that and be ransoming that data back to M&S. And so, yeah, this is continuing. I think ransomware payments went past £1 billion last year. The amount of payments the ransomware operators have actually got from this. Yeah. So a lot of organisations do pay as well.
And that's the point, Max, isn't it? In the end of the day, this is just the world we're going to have to live in, because it's always going to be a battle, a race, a tug of war, if you like, between those that want to cause damage and exploit the system for money and companies trying to continually fight it off.
Yeah, and we say, you know, it's if, not when, really. And that's what you have to, if you're running an organisation, you have to be aware that this will happen to you, and how do you prepare for that? So you don't assume that you'll stop the hackers getting in, but you need to prepare for that. We call them cyber drills. We want you to make prepping for a cyber, you know, crisis as ordinary as a fire drill. And so not just the technical teams you need, as I mentioned, you need your executive teams, you need your communication team, any team that's involved, you need them to understand what will happen and to practice, you know, preparation and practice.
Okay, Max, appreciate your time this morning from Immersive Labs there. Thank you. Okay, you're watching Business Live here on Sky News. Coming up in just a couple of minutes, we'll be looking at how the markets are doing. FTSE's pretty flat today. All the details after this commercial break.
show of military might and menace. Why should the West trust you?
Frankly, I don't care whether the West trusts us or not.
Sky News. Get the full story first.
Have a quick word for Sky News. Is the West right, i.e. fueling Russia's war machine? American journalist Evan Gershkovich is on trial here, but was first on display.
I'm Ivor Bennett, Sky's Moscow correspondent.
This is the game changer seat. Look, it even comes with binoculars. Flying nets, fly better. Thank you.
OK, let's have a look at those markets in a bit more detail now on this Tuesday morning. Speak to Janet Mui, who is from RBC Brewin Dolphin. Janet, as always, good morning to you. We've been talking about Donald Trump's 100 days and offers, those tariffs on place, particularly when it comes to China. And that's having some real-world impacts already, not least of all on companies like Shine, for example, upping the prices massively for US consumers.
Hi, good morning, Daryl. Thanks for having me. Yes, so currently the tariffs on China are 145%. That's really astronomical. It's basically, a huge obstacle for Chinese exporters into the US. And for companies like Shein and Temu, they operate on very, very thin profit margin, meaning, these exporters actually, they don't earn much profits. So when the tariffs are so high and they want to export to US, they just really have to raise the prices in order to keep its businesses. And at the end of the day, it is really US consumers who are going to pay. And especially, usually it is those consumers who are struggling more financially that opt to use these cheaper platforms. So ultimately, it is really the poorest of the consumers that are going to take the hit.
And it's fascinating, as we've been talking about, Decathlon, of course, are a massive sports retailer, saying that they're about to sell 30% of its China business at around more than $1 billion. It's a reflection, too, isn't it, that Western companies are looking at their operations in China.
Yes, I mean, as I said, these tariff rates are really astronomical. So if you have production in China, and you might want to actually look into diversify more of your production base in other countries. So this is really not just a short-term issue, but more longer-term thinking, strategic positioning for many businesses. But again, that is a lot of uncertainty, and it is really huge decisions for businesses to make. But I think so far recently there is some sign of de-escalation between the two superpowers. So there's just so much uncertainty, and I think we may keep hearing more news on that front and more businesses voicing out their concerns.
Yeah, and Jenna, that uncertainty is from the fact that during the first term, when tariffs were imposed on China, lots of firms moved their business to other countries in Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, for example, Cambodia and others. Then we saw massive tariffs on them. Then they were removed. And businesses don't quite know where to turn because for lots of these companies, it simply doesn't make sense to manufacture inside the US itself because that is just too expensive.
Yeah, I guess that's the issue. I think even with tariffs currently in place, it may still make sense for some business to keep part of their manufacturing in China just simply because the cost base is so much lower compared to the US. I believe, businesses will continue to shift their operation from China to elsewhere, particularly to Southeast Asia. I mean, currently the reciprocal tariff being announced has been paused. There is hope that it could be eventually scaled back. Ultimately, the prime target is China, so probably the other Southeast Asian economies are less at risk. So I guess it's just a really difficult question to answer at this stage. But as you're right, shifting production all back to the US is near impossible.
OK, Janet, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Janet Mui there. That's it from me. Back at 4:30 this afternoon. I'll see you then. Goodbye.